Japan, 1943. The world was already ablaze in the fury of war. Entire nations trembled as steel clashed, skies roared, and oceans boiled with conflict. Yet amid the chaos of the Pacific, a mystery emerged, one so strange, so impossible, that it would defy logic, terrify witnesses, and leave a scar of silence on Japan's military history. The night was heavy with rain as squadrons of Japanese warplanes prepared to launch from hidden airfields deep within the islands. Their mission was clear: patrol the waters, enforce control, and strike fear into any enemy who dared approach. Engines roared in unison, blades cut through the storm, and one by one, the machines lifted into the darkness. For commanders watching from the ground, it was an awe-inspiring sight. Rows of aircraft, wings glinting under flashes of lightning, ascending into the black void of the Pacific night. But then, silence. Radio chatter faded, calls for status went unanswered, and the blips on radar screens vanished as if erased by an invisible hand. Within hours, the fleet of warplanes, dozens strong, was gone. No wreckage, no distress signals, no survivors. Only the echo of their departure remained. Panic rippled through the Japanese command structure. How could an entire fleet vanish without trace? Theories spread like wildfire: enemy ambush, mechanical failure, even supernatural intervention. But no explanation fit. The skies had simply swallowed them whole. And as the hours turned to days, whispers began to grow. Whispers that something unimaginable had happened in those clouds. Something never meant for human eyes. Japan was left in shock. And the story of the vanishing warplanes became one of the most chilling mysteries of the Second World War. The disappearance struck the Imperial command like a thunderbolt. For Japan, already stretched thin across vast oceans and bleeding resources into every corner of the Pacific, the vanishing of an entire fleet of warplanes was not merely a loss, it was an unexplainable wound, one that threatened both military strength and psychological stability. When word first reached the command centers, disbelief was the immediate reaction. Seasoned officers who had seen battles lost and fleets destroyed could not comprehend what they were hearing. It was not uncommon for planes to crash, for squadrons to be ambushed, or for weather to claim machines in sudden bursts of violence. But this, an entire formation, trained men with hours of experience, engines freshly serviced, fuel tanks topped, weapons armed, gone. Not destroyed, not scattered, not even limping back with heavy damage. Simply gone, as if plucked from the sky by an invisible hand. The first hours after the loss were filled with desperate attempts to rationalize. Radio operators replayed the last transmissions again and again, straining to find some overlooked fragment. The voices were calm at first, routine exchanges between squadron leaders and ground control. Then came the faint hiss of static, growing louder, and a sudden crack that drowned everything. After that, only silence. No mayday, no urgent coordinates. Just the empty roar of static waves rolling endlessly across the receivers. For men trained to read voices like lifelines, that silence was more terrible than any scream. Search operations were launched immediately. Naval vessels scoured the suspected flight path, sweeping the waters with powerful lights that cut through the night and probed the darkness for floating wreckage. Aircraft from nearby bases were dispatched at dawn to comb the skies. Yet the sea lay empty. No oil slicks, no broken wings, no parachutes drifting in the wind. The sky revealed only endless grey clouds. It was as if the Pacific had swallowed them whole, without leaving even a ripple on its surface. In the headquarters, the atmosphere thickened with dread. Generals pored over maps, their fingers tracing lines across the vast ocean, trying to identify any possible enemy presence. Could American submarines have intercepted them? Could an ambush from carriers explain the sudden vanishing? But if there had been an attack, surely there would be signs, debris, explosions, even a single frantic radio call. None existed. The commanders, men who prided themselves on reason and control, found themselves circling questions without answers. The impossible loomed over them. Perhaps there was nothing to explain, because nothing remained. The mechanics and ground crews who had prepared the aircraft were interrogated next. Had there been overlooked technical faults? Had the engines been improperly serviced? But these men swore, with trembling hands and strained voices, that everything had been perfect. The machines had roared to life with confidence. The wings had been checked, the bolts tightened, the fuel clean. Nothing was amiss. The takeoff itself had been flawless, a regimented procession of steel and firepower rising into the storm like a blade being drawn. The very memory of that sight made the disappearance more unthinkable. To lose one plane to malfunction was tragedy. To lose dozens in the span of minutes without a shred of evidence was madness. In those first days, fear began to creep silently through the command structure. The Japanese military had built its power on discipline and precision, but this incident challenged both. How could one discipline soldiers to fight if the skies themselves were now unpredictable? How could one plan campaigns if fleets could vanish without trace? The questions eroded confidence like salt water against steel. It was said that one officer, upon hearing the first full report, slammed his fist so hard upon the table that his knuckles split open. He shouted that planes do not vanish, that men do not vanish, that something was being hidden. But even as his blood dripped onto the maps before him, no one could provide him with an answer. Outside the command halls, the whispers spread. Pilots preparing for future missions asked quiet, dangerous questions. If their comrades had been swallowed by the sky, could it happen again? Was there an unseen weapon at play? Some allied technology so advanced it could erase fleets without leaving a mark? Or was it something older, something beyond the reach of engines and guns? These questions were never voiced loudly in the presence of commanders, but they slithered through the ranks, carried from man to man, each whisper fanning the growing unease. Every attempt to reconstruct the event brought only frustration. Weather logs showed a violent storm that night, but storms had been flown through before, and rarely had they consumed squadrons so utterly. Radar records revealed the blips of the aircraft rising from the airfield, steady and strong. Then as lightning split the horizon, the blips flickered and disappeared, all within a handful of seconds. No scattering, no drifting, no gradual decline. Just disappearance, as if the machines had never been there. Scientists were consulted, meteorologists summoned, naval experts interrogated. Yet every explanation dissolved under the weight of one fact. There was nothing left behind. The Japanese Empire was a machine of war, and machines thrive on order. This event was chaos incarnate, a break in the natural rhythm of warfare, and it gnawed at the hearts of those sworn to command. Reports were written, sealed, and locked away in cabinets marked confidential. Official communiques to the public spoke only of technical losses and unexpected difficulties. Yet within those locked rooms, officers stared across tables at one another, their faces pale and weary, wondering if the truth would ever be known. The Pacific itself seemed to mock them. The waves rolled on, indifferent, concealing whatever secrets lay beneath. The storm clouds broke, and the skies returned to calm, blue silence. Nature offered no evidence, no testimony, only emptiness. And in that emptiness the minds of men turned dark. Some began to think of curses, of restless spirits, of ancient forces that did not wish to be disturbed. Others, clinging to logic, believed there must be a hidden enemy, a weapon yet undisclosed. But all were united by the same gnawing dread. They would never know. As days turned into weeks, search operations dwindled. Resources could not be wasted chasing phantoms, not when battles raged across the Pacific. Slowly, the incident was buried beneath new orders, new missions, new struggles. But those who had witnessed the departure of the warplanes, their wings shimmering against lightning, their engines roaring defiantly into the storm, would never forget. For them, the memory of that night was etched in fire and rain, a vision that ended not in triumph or tragedy, but in silence. The disappearance of the fleet became a wound that could not be spoken of. It lived in the shadows of conversations, in the unspoken fear behind the eyes of pilots, in the heavy pause of commanders staring too long at their maps. It was a reminder that even in an age of steel and fire, there were mysteries greater than man, powers hidden in the very skies men thought they commanded. And perhaps, some thought in their darkest moments, the warplanes had not simply vanished, but had been taken. As rumors spread, fear began to seep into the ranks, slowly at first, like a cold draft through the cracks of a fortress wall. The Japanese military, known for its rigid discipline and its iron will, could tolerate the loss of men, of machines, even of entire battles. But it could not tolerate uncertainty. And this disappearance was the very definition of uncertainty. In the barracks, in the hangars, in the mess halls where soldiers ate in silence, the whispers began. At first, they were no more than cautious speculation, spoken in hushed tones, but soon they grew darker, more insistent, until they carried the weight of legend. Men began to wonder if the sky itself was cursed, if the storm had not been mere weather, but something living, something ancient, something that had reached down and claimed the fleet for its own. Pilots, usually the most confident and daring of all soldiers, now carried unease in their eyes. They had always been taught that the sky was theirs to command, that engines and wings gave them dominion over clouds and storms. But now that certainty had been shattered. During the long nights before missions, they gathered in circles under dim lantern light, their voices hushed, but their words heavy. They spoke of comrades whose voices had been cut off mid-transmission, of men who had laughed only hours earlier and were now nothing more than phantoms. Some swore that when they looked into the storm that night, they had seen lights, strange lights glowing and shifting, not lightning, not flares, but something unnatural. They flickered in patterns, darting and weaving, before vanishing into the black. The memory clung to them, like an image burned into the eyes long after a flash has passed. The ground crews, too, began to share their own unsettling accounts. These men, who lived with grease on their hands and the smell of fuel in their lungs, were not prone to fantasy. Yet even they admitted to feeling something uncanny as they watched the planes vanish into the storm. Some said they heard voices carried on the wind. Not shouts, not thunder, but whispers, faint and distant, as though the storm itself were speaking. A few even confessed in secret that they had felt watched, as though unseen eyes gazed down from the clouds, waiting for the moment to close around the departing aircraft. As these tales spread, they began to change the very air of the airfields. The familiar clatter of tools, the steady rhythm of drills and briefings, the confident chatter of men preparing for flight. All of it dulled beneath the weight of something unspoken. Silence began to dominate the spaces where once there had been life. Men avoided looking too long at the horizon, as if afraid of what might look back. Even the sound of thunder now carried a sharper edge, a reminder of what had been lost. Commanders tried to stamp out the rumors, threatening punishment for those caught speaking of curses or strange lights. But the more they denied it, the more the whispers grew. Fear is a shadow that thrives in darkness, and in the absence of truth, imagination becomes the loudest voice. Soldiers began to tell one another that the fleet had not crashed, had not been shot down, but had crossed into another world, into a place beyond clouds and storms, a place from which no man could return. Some called it a punishment from the gods, others a warning, and still others a secret weapon of the enemy, one so powerful that the human mind could not comprehend it. The pilots who remained found themselves plagued with doubt. When they strapped into their cockpits, the roar of the engines no longer sounded like a promise of strength, but like a question. Would they return, or would they too vanish into silence? Some men, unable to bear the weight of that thought, requested reassignment, choosing to work the ground rather than face the sky again. Others forced themselves upward, pushing into the clouds with clenched jaws and pounding hearts, determined to prove that the skies could still be conquered. Yet even they carried a gnawing fear that the next storm would be their last. The storm itself became legend. Men spoke of it as though it had a will of its own, a hunger, They said it had opened its jaws and swallowed the fleet whole, that lightning was not mere electricity, but claws reaching down from above. When new storms gathered, men looked at them not with the wary respect of seasoned aviators, but with dread, as though each cloud might contain the same unseen force that had devoured their comrades. Among the rank and file, the story twisted further. Some claimed the storm had revealed shapes, dark, colossal forms moving within the clouds, larger than any plane, larger than any ship, shapes that no man-made machine could rival. Others spoke of glowing eyes that hovered in the black sky, vanishing only when the last warplane was gone. Whether these were born of truth or fear, no one could say. But they were told and retold, until even the most skeptical soldier felt a shiver at the mention of them. And yet beneath the fear, there was something else, an unspoken reverence. To many, the vanished pilots were no longer merely soldiers lost in war. They had become martyrs to an unknown force, men who had crossed into a realm beyond human reach. Their disappearance was terrifying, but it was also awe-inspiring, a reminder that the world still contained mysteries greater than steel and fire. For men who lived each day surrounded by death, the idea that their comrades had been taken by something vast and unknowable gave a strange kind of meaning. It was as though the warplanes had been claimed by the heavens themselves, lifted from the realm of men into a story that would never die. The commanders, however, could not afford reverence. For them, the growing superstition was dangerous. Armies cannot march on myths, and planes cannot fly on fear. They issued strict orders forbidding discussion of the disappearance, demanded absolute silence on the matter. But soldiers are human, and humans cannot silence their imagination. The more the truth was hidden, the more powerful the legend became. And in the long, sleepless nights of war, the story spread further than any order could reach. By the time weeks had passed, the disappearance was no longer just an incident. It had become a haunting. Men walked the runways at night and swore they heard engines in the distance, the ghostly roar of planes that no longer existed. Some said they saw shadows pass across the moon, wings cutting through the light, only to vanish when the eye tried to follow. For the soldiers who lived through those nights, reality and legend blurred together until they could no longer be separated. Fear had taken root in the heart of the Empire's warriors, and fear is a more powerful enemy than any fleet or army. The disappearance was not only a tactical mystery, it had become a psychological wound, spreading doubt like a sickness. The Japanese war machine, which prided itself on strength and certainty, now carried within it the seeds of uncertainty, planted by a storm and watered by whispers. And though the war would rage on, though countless battles still lay ahead, the memory of that night, the lights, the silence, the vanishing, would never fade. For Japan, the loss was more than military. It was spiritual, psychological, and profoundly unsettling. An empire already fighting on the edge of exhaustion could ill afford the disappearance of a fleet, but the deeper wound was invisible, carved into the minds of soldiers and citizens alike. At first, the matter was handled quietly, confined to classified reports and secret briefings between officers. The public was told nothing beyond vague references to technical difficulties, a phrase so hollow it rang with denial. But rumors, like smoke from a hidden fire, cannot be contained. Whispers slipped past the walls of command centers, carried by nervous tongues to airfields, naval bases, and eventually into the narrow alleys of the cities. And once the story reached the ears of ordinary people, it transformed into something darker, more enduring, a legend of war wrapped in mystery and fear. The silence of the military only deepened the unease. Official reports, stamped with crimson seals and locked away in metal cabinets, described the event in sterile terms. Missing aircraft, unexplained weather anomalies, presumed mechanical failures. But those who had been there, who had seen the fleet ascend into the storm and then vanish without a trace, knew that the reports were lies, or at least evasions. They carried memories too vivid to ignore, the roar of engines fading into static, the sudden absence of voices, the eerie calm that followed. These men and women did not need documents to tell them what had happened. They had felt it. They had stood in the rain, watching the impossible unfold. And though they spoke little, their silence itself became proof of something unspeakable. In Tokyo, the story spread in fragments, told quietly between friends and neighbors. Often late at night, when the streets were hushed and shadows stretched long, civilians had already grown accustomed to the hardships of war, rationing, bombings, the loss of loved ones. But this tale was different. It was not the story of brave men falling in battle, not of ships sunk or cities burned. It was of men who had been swallowed whole, taken without warning or reason. For the ordinary citizen, it was more terrifying than defeat, because defeat at least could be seen, measured, understood. This was the unknown, and the unknown gnawed at the spirit of a nation that thrived on certainty and control. As the weeks passed, the disappearance became a kind of ghost story. Families gathered around dim lamps and whispered of the vanished fleet. Children were warned not to stray too far into the night sky with their imagination, lest they be taken like the pilots. Superstition bled into daily life. Farmers in rural villages spoke of hearing distant engines above their fields, though no planes passed overhead. Fishermen claimed that the sea itself hummed at night, as though still echoing the vibrations of the vanished machines. Even in the heart of the empire, where the machinery of war clattered on with relentless determination, people could not escape the sense that something vast and invisible had brushed against their world. The commanders, meanwhile, struggled to maintain order within their ranks. They knew the truth could never be admitted openly. To acknowledge that an entire fleet had vanished into thin air would be to admit weakness before both soldiers and civilians. And so they buried the incident beneath bureaucracy. Reports were shredded, rewritten, locked away under top-secret stamps. Any pilot who spoke too freely was silenced with threats of court-martial. Yet the very act of suppression only sharpened suspicion. Soldiers noticed when questions went unanswered, when documents disappeared, when superiors spoke too quickly to dismiss what had happened. And in their silence, imagination flourished all the more. To those on the inside, the memory lingered like a spectre. Officers who had witnessed the loss carried it like a weight on their conscience. Some avoided speaking of it altogether, fearing the weakness it might reveal. Others confided in diaries, scratching words onto paper that might never be read, trying desperately to put shape to what they had seen. One described it as a hole in the sky, another as a silence so vast it seemed alive. Such words, though hidden in journals and private letters, captured the unease more powerfully than any official report. The event had not merely erased planes, it had carved emptiness into the hearts of men. As the war dragged on, new disasters struck Japan. Battles lost, ships sunk, cities reduced to rubble. Yet beneath the roar of bombs and the cries of the wounded, the story of the vanished warplanes persisted like an undertow, quiet but unyielding. In moments of despair, men would recall the fleet, and some wondered if the disappearance had been a warning, a sign that the empire was being abandoned by the heavens. Others, more pragmatic, believed it was a secret shame, buried by those in power to protect their pride. But whether seen as divine omen or political cover-up, the effect was the same, a seed of doubt planted deep in the soil of the nation's soul. By the time the guns of the Pacific fell silent and Japan faced its surrender, the disappearance had already taken on the shape of legend. Veterans spoke of it in hushed voices, their eyes darting as though afraid the very sky might be listening. Civilians remembered it as one of many horrors whispered during the war, a story never printed in newspapers, but carried by word of mouth through generations. For some, it became a tale of ghosts, pilots forever circling above the Pacific, searching for a home they could never find. For others, it became a parable, a reminder of the dangers of arrogance, of assuming man could ever truly master the forces of nature and war. In the years that followed, Researchers and historians tried to piece together the fragments. Some sought rational explanations, violent weather phenomena, undetected enemy intervention, even navigational errors that sent the fleet into the sea. But no evidence was ever found. The Pacific kept its secrets. Others turned to the supernatural, suggesting portals, curses, or other worldly forces at work. Yet none of these theories could be proven, and so the story remained suspended between fact and myth, a wound in history that refused to close. For those who had lived through it, however, no explanation was necessary. The truth was not in documents or theories, but in the memory of that night. The storm, the lights, the silence, and the unshakable certainty that something had happened beyond the comprehension of man. Long after the war ended, long after the uniforms were folded away and the bases abandoned, the men who had stood on that runway carried it with them. Some spoke of it on their deathbeds, confessing at last the terror they had hidden. Others never uttered a word, letting the memory dissolve into silence as the fleet itself had dissolved into the night. And so, the vanishing warplanes of Japan remained a story without end. Not a battle, not a defeat, but a mystery that lingered in the shadows of history. The empire that had once commanded its pilots to conquer the skies was itself left haunted by the reminder that there are forces greater than steel, greater than war, and greater than man. The fleet was gone, but its absence was eternal, echoing through every whisper, every silence. Every eye turned skyward in wonder and fear.